The arrival of rain brings a sigh of relief to many of Australia's northern livestock producers. But the big storms of the early wet can wash away valuable soil and nutrients. Jane Drinkwater digs the dirt on ways to keep that soil on farm where it's needed.
Each year, many producers face diminishing pasture productivity due to the cumulative effects of erosion, removing nutrients and valuable topsoil. It's a challenging problem, particularly if there's little ground cover to begin with.
When we came here in the 90s, it was in the middle of the worst drought that this area has seen for 100 years. So we saw firsthand the destruction that's caused when pastures become totally denuded.
But Rob and Sue Bonetto have reversed the trend, improving their property's pasture even through drought years, thanks to their involvement in a grazing management trial. Over the past decade, with MLA support, CSIRO has studied runoff from the Bonetto's property, how much there is, and the soil and nutrients it carries. For 5 of those years, Queensland Primary Industries and Fisheries has measured improvements gained through various management strategies.
The 2 strategies we looked at were different forms of wet season spelling. So one was implementing a wet season spell every second year on a paddock, and the other was a wet season spell in 2 consecutive years on the same paddock. And in addition to that, we did a feed budget to base the number of livestock that go into the paddock to determine stocking rates, so that by the end of the dry season there was still sufficient feed in the paddocks to give ground cover, to promote infiltration and get the pasture growing for the following season.
Even though there were several drought years included in the study and the pasture was very sparse to begin with, the results showed a dramatic improvement, with hill slope cover increasing from around 40% to 70%.
In the paddock that was wet season spelled every second year, the perennial grasses, the better perennial grasses, increased by 150% over the duration of the project. On the paddock that had 2 consecutive wet season spells, the better perennial pasture species actually increased by 250%. Now, in both instances, it started from a low base, but it was a very significant improvement.
We've seen a 70% decline in sediment and nutrient yields, so the amount of sediment nutrients coming off the hill slopes, and that's mainly been due to the increased cover.
The CSIRO taught us how to do fodder budgets, and we learnt to read the grasses, and during the course of the project, even though initially there was very dry years, we saw an improvement in the quality of the pasture. The bare spots on our property, we saw them over time close up to the point now where there's very few bare spots. There's just pasture pretty much everywhere. We're confident that in big rain events our loss of sediment would be extremely reduced.
You don't have to be a rocket scientist to work out that increasing ground cover will likely decrease erosion. But it's not just about getting cover across that ground. It's the quality of the pasture that's going to be there in the future.
Perennial plants which have a dense, 3-dimensional structure help trap leaf and soil matter and reduce the force of water flowing downhill during rain events, while deep root structures allow more water to penetrate, reducing runoff.
We really would like to encourage more of the native species, the tussock grasses, to return in these landscapes, because they've got a really big root mass and they really get the water deep into the soil profile and can hold it there for a lot longer. So when the droughts do come, we've got a much bigger water storage in the system.
The vast majority of sediment is eroded where water gains momentum as it flows downhill with little or no vegetation to slow its progress.
Generally bare patches at the bottom of the hill slope is where we're having real problems, and that's where we're getting, about 85% of our soil loss is coming from a very small, say 5% of the catchment area.
Though the study has produced a reduction in hill slope erosion, sediment loss has continued from gullies and riverbanks, and volumes of water runoff haven't significantly declined, verifying that improving catchment and grazing land health requires more than just increasing the amount of hill slope ground cover.
We are seeing changes in water quality off the hill slopes, but that response isn't being observed at the end of the catchment. And that's because we've got lags in the system. Some of the soil that comes off the hill slopes gets stored in gullies, and if we get a drought, that may not be remobilised again for another few years. So meeting our end of catchment water quality targets will be challenging in these environments that, where there's storage of sediments and nutrients.
And it's lower in the catchment that water quality is an increasing concern, as silt and sand flowing downstream can fill in pools, prevent downstream producers from recharging irrigation aquifers, and here in the Burdekin, impact on the marine environment of the Great Barrier Reef.
Obviously, the work that we're doing in the Burdekin catchment is really critical because of the proximity and because the rivers are actually emptying into the Great Barrier Reef Lagoon. But the principles that we're talking about apply throughout Northern Australia. So in terms of the benefits you can get from ground cover, from the practices that have been had here, it's the same story. We're going to have producers that are both productive and feel proud of the work that they're actually doing on their properties. And it's critical that we can underpin that work that they're doing.
The economic arguments for reducing erosion stack up. DBI modelling of the trends which emerged from Virginia Park show although heavier grazing initially produced a higher gross margin than wet season spelling and fodder budgeting, after 3 years these alternative management techniques produced the better economic return. Results at 10 years showed 50 cents per hectare gross margin for heavier stocking rates and $13 for the management techniques used on Virginia Park.
If we go back to the start with the project, the whole district was in fairly poor condition as far as land condition and pasture condition goes. This project has demonstrated very clearly that with some relatively simple technology and adoption over 4 or 5 years, and even in drought years, that you can start to get improvement.
Using practices such as wet season spelling, forage budgeting, conservative stocking rates, you can actually have an impact on the water quality leaving your hill slopes, and at the same time you can actually maintain your productivity and your bottom line. So there are real benefits to be had there from producers, and there's real benefits to be had there from the environment and the broader community as well.